In the summer of 1977, 3 young Girl Scouts were assaulted and murdered on their first night at Camp Scott in Mays County, Oklahoma. Hours later, a camp counselor found the girls' bodies stuffed in their sleeping bags and scattered through the woods. Camp Scott had been operating for decades. Many young girls stayed here for a 2-week getaway. Tucked deep into dense woods, the campsite was a bit scary at first. However, in the day, it was quite beautiful. The units, all named after Native American tribes, consisted of several camper tents and counselor camper tents. The tents sat on platforms and held 4 cots for sleeping, while all 4 canvas sides rolled up. Mind you, this was before Friday the 13th, and they weren't scared of humans lurking in the woods. If anything, maybe animals. Michelle Hoffman had aged out of summer camp, but on Sunday, June 12, 1977, the 15-year-old returned as a camp counselor. Excitement filled the air as over 100 Oklahoma young girls waited to board their bus. Michelle understood how intimidating the first day of camp was. She spotted 10-year-old Denise Milner, who was shy. Michelle, thinking she could provide some encouragement, walked over to Denise and her mother, Betty Milner, and assured her not to worry. After about an hour's drive and many songs sung, the bus turned off onto Cookie Trail Road. While familiar campers jumped out to find their tents, Michelle made sure to bring Denise to Kiowa tent number 8 herself. It was close to both the bathrooms and the kitchen. Denise immediately made friends with 8-year-old Lori Farmer and 9-year-old Michele Guse. So here's the campsite, and over here is where the girls slept. It was pretty secluded despite it looking otherwise, and other campers did not want to stay there. Nevertheless, the children went to their tents to write letters to their parents that night. Then they fell asleep, excited for the fun to come next day. However, that night there was an early evening thunderstorm, making it especially dark. One girl, Amy Sullivan, recalled writing in her diary that evening by flashlight. Quote, "It was the darkest dark I had ever known," she said. "I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or shut." Meanwhile, Counselor Carla Wellhite heard something in the middle of the night, and it wasn't the rain or thunder. She got up to investigate, but the moaning would stop when she got closer. Then it would start again when she left. She thought nothing of it and thought it was possibly an animal. She didn't want to inspect any further as she feared the animal might attack her, so she went back to sleep, something she would later regret. At 6 a.m. on June 13, Carla woke up early to take a quick shower. That's when she saw 3 sleeping bags on the ground. Thinking she better pick them up to dry up, she walked closer. Confused and horrified by what she was seeing, Carla turned and ran for help. She returned with the camp director's husband, who had been a nurse. Only then did it sink in, and she later recalled being filled with, quote, "a terrible fear." Lori and Michelle were zipped inside their sleeping bags. Carla had not known this at first sight. Camp counselors quickly came up with a way to redirect campers away from the bodies by acting as if they were upset with them for not letting them sleep the night before, and as punishment they had to go for a hike. Once police were on the scene, camp officials began sending the Girl Scouts home on buses and out of the camp, where police were now investigating a triple murder. None of the girls or their families knew why camp was over after one day. The terrible part was the parents of the victims, the girls that were murdered, were told that there was an accident at camp. There was a meeting where they were informed, but only later did they find out from news reports that their daughters were murdered.
Identified as 9-year-old Michele Guse of Broken Arrow, 8-year-old Lori Lee Farmer of Tulsa, and 10-year-old Denise Milner, also of Tulsa.
Autopsies would reveal that Lori and Michelle were killed by blunt force trauma to the head. Denise had been beaten, but also strangled. They had all been essayed.
We would say between 2 to 4 o'clock this morning.
Did anybody else hear anything, Pete?
No one. We've canvassed the area. There's not been any commotion, nothing out of the ordinary.
Upon their investigation, police found tent number 8 covered in blood. They also learned about the strange noises that several other campers and counselors had heard throughout the night. Around 1:30 a.m., multiple people heard moaning sounds coming from the direction of tent number 8. Approximately 30 minutes later, a camper in tent number 7 was awoken when someone with a flashlight opened the flap to the tent. At around 3 a.m., another girl heard a scream come from the section of camp where tent number 8 was located. At the same time, another camper heard a scream, followed by someone crying, "Mama, Mama." Unsure of what to do, both girls went back to sleep. Oddly, the alleged killer may have issued a warning before the crimes occurred, in April 1977, 2 months before the murders. Training sessions for camp counselors were held at Camp Scott. However, the weekend ended prematurely when a counselor cabin was ransacked, and a disturbing note was discovered in an empty box of donuts. The handwritten note warned, quote, "We are on a mission to kill 3 girls in Tent 1. Someone had also created an effigy of a man which they hung off a tree. While both the effigy and the note were strange and upsetting, the letter also mentioned Martians. The camp administrator dismissed the entire series of events as a tasteless prank, and later the camp counselors admitted to the prank. Which is a strange coincidence, seeing how later there was DNA of an unknown female left at the crime scene. One of the victims' mothers also felt that a female had also been involved in the deaths, but the DNA was never identified. Investigators found a large red flashlight on top of the bodies, and although there was a fingerprint on the lens, it was too smudged to be identified. Newspaper was stuffed into the casing to prevent the batteries from rattling. The victim's tent was covered in blood, and in that blood was a print of a 9.5 size shoe. A larger search of the 400-acre wood turned up woman's eyeglasses, duct tape, and rope. Despite their findings, the investigation was messy. The scene was not secured immediately as it should have been. This meant that it was pretty much a free-for-all for investigators and camp staff to wander through as they pleased. Thankfully, the bodies were secured by officers. However, given that it was 1970s, forensic analysis of body fluids were limited. This meant that there was only so much that they could do with the swabs taken from the girls. There was blood on the floor of the tent, indicating the girls had initially been attacked inside and then carried outside. Just days later, after a tip from local squirrel hunters, officials descended on a nearby cave, where they found a roll of masking tape with a piece of plastic stuck to it that matched the tape found on the flashlight, and newspaper that had been stuffed inside the flashlight at the crime scene. Perhaps the most interesting thing found in the cave is a note written on the wall, which read, 77-6-17, the killer was here, bye-bye fools. But it wasn't until a prison employee recognized 2 wedding photos also found at the cave, and later broadcasted on the nightly news that police believed they had their suspect, fugitive and convicted rapist Gene Lorey Hart. Police learned that Hart had developed the photos as a part of a prison work program. Even if Hart wasn't the murderer, he came across as a really bad guy, obviously. Given his past criminal convictions and the fact that his mother lived about a mile from Camp Scott, Sheriff Weaver thought that he was a good suspect for the murders. He had already escaped from prison twice. The first time he was in prison was for raping 2 pregnant women, tying them up and putting tape all over their face, then taking them out into the middle of nowhere and leaving them to die. Miraculously, one of the women were able to break free and get help. Hart was caught soon after this, but disturbingly, he was paroled not long after this for the murders and rape. Then, while on parole, Hart was arrested for burglary. This time he was given a life sentence for breaking his parole, which is absolutely disturbing and disgusting that he got away with rape, yet he was arrested and sent to prison for life for burglary. And not surprisingly, Hart escaped from jail again, and this time he was actually gone. No one could find him anywhere. This happened in 1973. When the murders took place in 1977, he was still on the run. There was a large Cherokee community in the Cookson Hills, of which Hart was a part of. Hart was well respected and surrounded by people who wanted to help him and protect him from the law enforcement. Surprisingly, many people from this community felt that Hart was a good guy. After a 10-month manhunt, one of the largest in Oklahoma history, Hart was finally captured at a cabin in the Cookson Hills on April 6, 1978. During the trial the following year, Hart's defense attorneys claimed that he was framed and questioned how the black and white wedding photos ended up in the cave, because Hart allegedly left them behind after he escaped. Quote, "Our take from that was that evidence had been planted," says Hart's defense attorney. A growing number of community members and supporters also believed Hart was not guilty. To raise money for their defense, a community hog fry dinner was organized, and supporters wore t-shirts that read, quote, "Stop the Mays County Railroad." signifying the community's belief that Hart was being scapegoated. The Cherokee Tribal Council even donated $12,500. I want to point out the racism during the hunt for Hart, but also during the trial as well. Investigators believe that Hart was a mythical creature, most likely because they were embarrassed that they couldn't track him down. Their search dogs also mysteriously died, and they believe that this was some Native American magic. They also believed that Hart would turn into a bird and fly away each time they grew closer to him. They even said that Hart was not a part of the human race. After 21 months, the trial finally began. The state's case depended upon two types of evidence: the items found at the cave and the pair of glasses and roll of masking tape found at the crime scene, as well as the two photos that were linked to Hart. In addition, biological evidence, including semen and hair samples, were found on the girls. A footprint was also found in the mud after the thunderstorm on the evening of the murders. Now, DNA would not be introduced until the 1980s, and hair evidence would also be discredited as a forensic technique. So police admitted they didn't have any conclusive proof Hart had committed the murders. The defense used this to their advantage and put the prosecution on trial. The hair was inconclusive, the footprints did not match the size of Hart's foot, and the evidence found in the cave was not convincing beyond a reasonable doubt. On March 20, 1979, the jurors announced a stunning verdict: not guilty. The prosecution pointed out that Hart was in no way going free. He was still going to serve 300 years for previous rape and burglary charges. Gene Lorey Hart died in prison a little more than 2 months after being acquitted in 1979 from a heart attack. Now let's fast forward to 2019. Authorities retested the DNA sample that was found at the crime scene, and in 2022 they released that, quote, the DNA strongly suggested that Hart was the murderer. Sheriff Reed said, quote, unless something new comes up, something brought up to light that we are not aware of, I am convinced where I'm sitting of Hart's guilt and involvement in this case. Now, personally, I'm unsure if Hart ever committed the crimes at Camp Scott. Do I think he's guilty of other crimes? Definitely. He definitely belongs where he is today, and even if he were alive, I think he deserves the life sentence. However, we know that the crime scene was never secured and that there was DNA of an unknown female. Who was that female? And if Hart committed the crimes, did he act alone? If it wasn't Hart, then someone else got away with murder. And I understand that with a cold case, you want to close it and give closure to the families, and you also want the community to feel safe. But we can't just point fingers at people and let the killer get away. And we've seen this happen with the West Memphis 3 and many other cases. I can definitely make a video on that as well. If you're interested, let me know. So do you think Hart did it? And if he did he act alone? Let me know what you think. And before I go, thank you for watching, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button and like button. It helps me so much. Take care and stay safe.